Hello, everyone, and welcome to CantoSense. We're here to navigate through the Chinese culture and embrace it for Christian living. My parents were immigrants from Hong Kong. I was born and raised in Canada. And in my childhood, my mom would often say things like, don't go to bed with wet hair, or if you're heaty or eat hay, then you shouldn't eat potato chips. You'll get a sore throat. And all of these things, when your mom says them, make you wonder if it's just old wives' tales or just stuff mom always says. But as you get older, you realize that these all fall under traditional Chinese medicine, or TCM. Then the further question is TCM believable? And then as a Christian, are there certain things we should be aware of? Are there spiritual implications?
I guess it's not just a Canadian thing, because growing up in Malaysia as a third generation Malaysian Chinese, we hear the same stories. If you have had too much fried food, you get hitty, and then you have to balance it out by drinking something that's more cooling, like herbal tea and things like that. I remember working with some missionaries who were using acupuncture as a form of ministry. And it was interesting because there was a lot of just pushback by some quarters with regards to why are we using this kind of treatment that is steeped in a traditional understanding of the body. Does traditional necessarily mean that it's paganistic or wrong or bad and we should reject?
Our special guest has written books, done immense research on this topic, and we look forward to him sharing his insights. We want to give a warm CantoSense welcome to Pak Wah. He is the principal of Biblical Graduate School of Theology in Singapore. He is a church historian and also an author. Welcome, Pak Wah. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you. It's my pleasure. Thanks, Hannah and Ai-Ching.
Traditional Chinese medicine is probably one of the most frequently asked questions that we get. You have written 2 books on this and obviously have done a lot of research. Your book on the Dao of Healing, as well as a slightly more digestible book on a Christian perspective on Chinese medicine. So we've heard from both camps, right? One would say, TCM, traditional Chinese medicine, is, quack medicine because it's all superstition. Once you become a follower of Jesus, none of these should be relevant to you. On the other hand, we've also heard this is based on empirical evidence that it works, and it is definitely a discipline that we can redeem as Christians. How would you approach TCM? I mean, based on your theological, philosophical, and medical research that you've done.
Most people have concern about that traditional Chinese medicine is Taoist, because TCM uses the categories of yin and yang. That's often what's been claimed, or qi and so on. And Taoists do so, then the conclusion is that TCM must be Taoist. You'll be surprised, actually, it was the Han Confucians who basically introduced yin-yang ideas into the Han Confucian cosmological system, which is then applied to all of life, scientific endeavors and so on. And that is how yin-yang ideas as a philosophical category enters into Han Chinese medicine. The religious Taoism doesn't come on board until the decline of the Han Dynasty. It was much later than the development of Han Chinese medicine, which means that if they do use Chinese medicine, they are users of it and they don't create it. So just as Christians who use Panadol or ibuprofen don't make ibuprofen Christian, but we just use it because it's the best medicine around at that time. There is no basis to saying that Chinese medicine is influenced by religious Taoism or Buddhism for that matter.
It is not that traditional Chinese medicine is rooted in the philosophy of Taoism or Confucianism necessarily, but rather the practice of traditional Chinese medicine has already been in existence, but those categories or labels were introduced into the practice of traditional Chinese medicine.
You take acupuncture, right? It's pre-Han Dynasty. You have acupuncture practice, but in order to have medical theory, you need a philosophical framework to frame it. Correct. And so it was during the Han period where yin-yang theory were introduced by the Confucians, as a way of framing it and explaining
Right.
how acupuncture works. If you look at yin-yang theory, it's basically something that's intrinsically Chinese in the sense that you cannot avoid being Chinese without dealing with yin-yang. It is there when you do Chinese calligraphy because you have to decide what is black and what is white, the paper. That is yin-yang. It is there when you talk about we need to have harmonious relationship with other people because what is is basically yin-yang harmony. Basically want to say that yin-yang is Taoist and therefore we should
reject. Yeah.
We should reject it, then you basically rejected the whole Chinese culture. So a better way of approaching that is just to consider whether yin-yang theory is something that is compatible, doesn't contradict biblical faith. And I do think that that's the case.
So what would you say to someone who then argues if yin yang pervades all of Chinese identity, culture, and life, and if yin yang is associated, as it is believed, with Taoism, therefore we should reject all aspects of Chinese culture?
Most of us, because of our training in modern science and exposure to modern medicine, our bias is that philosophy of nature. So is break the system down into the dots, and from the dots, I can understand the system. And I should be able to see from the dots how everything is connected together. That's a very good approach in terms of helping us to organize knowledge and understanding of the world. But we need to recognize there's nothing biblical or unbiblical about this. It is just a way of organizing knowledge. So yin-yang basically takes a more systematic approach. It's not the dots in themselves, but the relationship between dots, and make sure the relationship are stable in order for the whole system to balance itself. So what you then have here are two non-biblical ways of organizing the complexity in the world. They both lend themselves to certain good results. They both have certain limitations because they were invented by human beings. And so we shouldn't put them against each other, but they are just two complementary lenses that we look at the world. But we should never confuse it with the fact that these are not biblical ideas. They are just ideas we use to organize knowledge. We shouldn't say they are Christian. We shouldn't pitch them against themselves to say one is more Christian than the other. A treatment, if it is worth its salt, should be empirical, which means that it has been used several times, so much so that if you use this, you have predictive results.
From what you're saying, it sounds like it's totally okay for Christians to engage in TCM. But as we know, TCM is so broad and there's tons of different practices, different ways of using it. Is there any area of it that we should be concerned about?
Chinese medicine oftentimes is associated with Chinese religious practices, particularly by the practitioners, not helped by the fact that this is often portrayed in Hollywood movies and TV dramas and so on. The reality is most Chinese medical practice nowadays is basically atheistic or agnostic.
Yeah.
And we have the mainland China to thank because in the 1960s, they severed that religious link.
Yeah.
And basically, every single thing that's been taught in the TCM hospitals and TCM schools, colleges in China has to be a-religious. If a TCM doctor attempts to provide religious treatment, chances are he will lose his license.
So it's really the practitioners that are bringing the religious elements in because it's not inherent that there are religious elements in TCM.
I think where people are more uncomfortable about TCM is also the philosophy is right in your face. So you can say that, your yin-yang 不协调, your yin and yang is disharmony, right? Or your qi is going the wrong direction. This all looks very strange, right? You don't find that modern medical physicians use that level of philosophical language.
There's so many different practices. And obviously there are some that is quack. I mean, we read in the papers, it's really not traditional Chinese medicine, but rather it's just some con man who calls himself a Chinese doctor and does all kinds of ridiculous stuff. Is for us to get ourselves educated with regards to the different practices instead of just assuming they are all the same. We should be open to explore traditional Chinese medicine because they are empirical, probably not in the traditional or conventional Western way of understanding empirical, but definitely empirical. It is just a different way of framing medical knowledge.
Thank you so much, Pak Wah, for joining us. Your insight and your ability to articulate a lot of this very complex information has been so helpful to us. I think my personal takeaway is that, as with most topics we discuss on CantoSense, it's really not an all or nothing game. And when he talked about, the tension of being able to hold, two different ideas or two different ways of thinking, in tension, I think that's a major part of the Asian culture and the Chinese culture specifically. Well, thank you so much for joining us. We hope to see you again at CantoSense. God bless.